once again, good afternoon to all the speakers, Chancellor of your university, Honorable Dean, whose invitation I received. Thank you so much for the kind invitation. I'll just, yeah, that's fine. So, and thanks to, of course, Tonmoy and Shondi for organizing this whole thing. I believe it's going to be a very fruitful session, and I'm typically in the elite circle that I have learned so much from Professor Sarkar, Professor Marjit, and I have always been, enthralled by the ideas that have come up in the discussions with Professor Marjit and Sarkar from time to time. What I'm going to talk about, and I discussed this thing partly with Shondeep last evening, that I'm going to show you a model of regional specialization and regional mobility, particularly in view of the migration related issues that have come up so compelling to our lives in so many ways during the lockdown and as an outcome of the COVID-19 pandemic throughout the country. So I would try to, assume that some of you would follow and actually go along with me in trying to explain a structure. If you are not happy with the, technicalities of it, don't bother about it. I'm still going to tell you the main tenets of what this regional economy models might actually be of essence and of some importance in view of how crisis can lead to relocation of workers from one place to another, given that they have already been moving from one place in search of jobs or higher pay and things like that. So as a matter of fact, I would show you three things. One, I would talk about the basic structure of the economy. I would talk about the kind of fiscal transfers that are given by the center to the states, as well as the expenditures made by both center and state on both revenue and capital expenditures across India from time to time over a span of long 20 years since 1991 and so on and so forth, just to motivate the fact that, and also to complement certain things that Shugotoda actually gave it an even more important impetus at helping me out in going through what I'm trying to say here, is that infrastructure is an important element in this whole debate about how economies suffer from an economic crisis like we are seeing right now, and their way out of such crisis in the medium to long run by say 2021 and so on and so forth. So some of the essential components that I'm going to discuss about are the unskilled labor, their mobility issues, the skilled labor, wherever they are being utilized and wherever they are stuck during this pandemic, as well as the follow-up and growth of infrastructure across regions in the country, which has an influence on the production of commodities where both skilled and unskilled labors are directly used. So before I go into that, I'll share my screen. I'll start off with certain basic discussions of the development impacts of the COVID-19 crisis and the regional mobility issues. So I will do the slideshow and go on to the the PowerPoint presentation here. I hope most of you can see this. It's some right up here, and if you would kindly allow me, it wouldn't take more than 15 to 20 minutes. I would read through some of these writings, because given so many participants here, if I just show you the slides and talk side by side, it is very difficult to communicate over the Zoom, because it's not a platform where I can see how the participants and the audience is actually getting communicated with in terms of the points I'm trying to make. So, as you have already seen, a large number of individuals, predominantly unskilled workers, have moved from one point to another during the economic crisis. So like I said, this is going to complement and extend some of the arguments made by Professor Sarkar and Professor Marjit, with a particular focus on regional mobility of workers and how regional development has got everything to do with it, including formation and creation as well as sustenance of infrastructure facilities in particular regions. Okay. So according to some estimates, the movement is to the tune of 80 million individuals in the last 2 months that has happened across different states in the country. So basically, what is at stake? First of all, it means that so many individuals at some point moved out of their source region in search of jobs and in some cases higher pay, the wages that they do not get in their locations where they are from, that's a source, right? Or it could be both. Number one, it could be lack of jobs in the same location that they're in, as well as higher wages and higher pay in another location, which has made them move about across different parts of the country. And this is, of course, not restricted to the country alone. People have moved out. People regularly move out to the Gulf areas, from Kerala, from even our Malda, Murshidabad, from Orissa, from different other parts of from UP and all other parts of the country in search of jobs and higher pay. But I am focusing especially on the regional distribution within the country so that we can really focus on the question of the migration within the country and how migrants have actually gone back and forth between locations during this particular crisis. So what caused this great migration within the country is important. There's no doubt about it. But what can reverse this trend is perhaps equally important in view of similar crisis in future. Because once the lockdown happens, once the borders are sealed down, right, and there are possibilities that new opportunities do not open up in other places, the whole onus is on the locations from where they belong to create jobs and to keep them in some form of activity involved. Otherwise, there would be complete chaos within the system. There would be requirement for moving out, and there would be artificial stoppage on that. This is something one cannot afford in a democratically elected government, using a federal structure within the country to administer and accommodate this kind of activities. So I show that infrastructure affects formation of skill and retention of skilled workers. This is the part I'm going to use as a regional model. This is a model which I used recently in a volume published by Omid Wattobal and another person from University of Amsterdam. It came out, so you will see some equations with chapter numbers in them. It's nothing but because I copied directly from the chapters. Many of my staff are still with my institution. I couldn't bring them over back home. So in any case, I'll keep on explaining one by one the intricacies of how this regional economy model has to do with the regional mobility of factors of production. Now, this access to infrastructure and the use of it can be directly extended to unskilled labor also. And the effects on the unskilled, as I find out for the results, is staggered during the pandemic, whereas the effect on skill is less so. This is one of the main tenets. If you don't go through the technicalities of it, this is something we take home. So short-term unemployment, it would mean, according to some studies and some surveys that have come out, which is, of course, I should mention, it is a privately run survey, and I have personal worries about the quality of this survey, because this was done on only 3,500 respondents across the country. You can imagine that a small sample like this, and people like, Shondeep, Tonmoy, all of you have been in Indian Statistical Institute, you would agree with me in the first place that a small sample as 3,500 for a country like India is probably very unrepresentative or non-representative of the true picture. Yet, people have found, or that particular institution have found, that close to 12 crore, which is about 120 million jobs, have been lost in the past 3 months, of which roughly 80 million jobs belong to migrant workers alone. This is a serious amount. 80 million jobs is equivalent to German population, right? So for a country on a sudden impetus, so many jobs lost, has to have a micro as well as a huge macroeconomic crisis already in the process, or just waiting in the fringes to become much more severe as we slowly go out into from the lockdown. Now, it implies that the people who have gone in for the jobs was actually because of the fact that it's still the fact that capital draws in workers. This was more like the Barlow's report, and I hope Professor Marjit and Professor Sarkar, Professor Ray might remember that this was after the Second World War. A report came out. I mean, not by not like you were there, but just if you have come across this kind of information, a report came out that in England the government was trying to relocate people to places which are war ravaged, but nobody wanted to go. It had to be the case that investments went to those war-ravaged places first, and then people followed. So it's more like people follow capital rather than capital seeing the opportunity to come and use a large stock of unskilled and skilled labor in a particular location. So this process seems to be still in practice and still in vogue in a country like India, where more economic activities, larger and richer set of capital stock actually keeps on attracting workers from rest of the country. So it could be Punjab, it could be Maharashtra, it could be parts of Gujarat, which attracts workers from rest of the country just because they are more capital rich compared to some of the other states in the during the same contemporary time period. So the similar capital, the draw of capital can possibly be applied to the draw of infrastructure, which regulates the stock and flow of workers in a almost similar or analogous fashion. Now, what would mean by human capital, and this is important just for the sake of if there are younger students here, you would know that some of these statements are by none less than Professor Gary Becker himself, which says that any analysis based on human capital, and why am I actually talking about human capital suddenly here? Because we are going to talk about the use of skill in certain sectors and how skill is trapped in locations. And even if they wish to go back, even if they want to go back during the pandemic, they are not going to be able to do that because infrastructure is short in places which they have actually left for a longer term appointment and longer tenure in some of the states. So what would human capital actually mean in this case? Any analysis based on human capital assumes that individuals maximize welfare, and you would see that these words carry importance even right at this moment as they conceive of it, whether they be selfish, altruistic, loyal, spiteful, or even masochistic in their appeal or applications to their own self optimizing behavior. Their behavior is also forward looking, and it is also consistent over time, right? So if you reflect on the current situation, you would see that skilled workers who are endowed with certain levels of human capital are probably thinking along this kind of definitional categories that we are creating, a la Gary Becker, Jacob Mincer, and many other people who have worked on this issue. In particular, the individuals who are endowed with human capital, they try as best to anticipate the uncertain consequences of their action. Number two, forward-looking behavior, as they show, is still rooted in the past. For the past can exert a long shadow on attitudes and values, which basically means that if they have moved from one place to another in search of high-skilled jobs, it's dependent on their past and the past behavior which they have witnessed and which have actually influenced their behavior as of now. Actions are constrained by income, time, imperfect memory, and so on and so forth. I'm not going further into that. These opportunities are largely determined by the private and collective action of other individuals and organizations, right? So, given this spectrum of human capital and unskilled labor's resources that's available at the regional level, do I see that the social sector spending, as Professor Sarkar briefly mentioned, through infrastructure development, through public provisions of the capital goods regions, has anything to do with it? You see, the budgetary allocations seem to have gone down since the post-reform period, right? So if you look at the first column on the top, I'm putting my cursor here, the plan, non-plan as it used to be called then, and the plan, non-plan as it used to be called later on after the reforms, have typically changed for revenue expenditure, which is up here, and capital expenditure. So much of the expenditure that's being spent by the government, central and state, is for revenue and maintenance expenditure, much less for creation of capital. Okay, so it has gone down from 12.41 pre-reform to 9.87 post-reform, 33.839 pre-reform to 20.67 post-reform. And this is, an earlier data. I'll update it with up to 2014-15 in the next slide and so. If you follow it up with typical social sector spending by central and state governments, you can again see that pre-reform, it was 54.7 by the central government. It has come down to 45.8 in the post-reform period. Again, it's early 2000s, but still the drop is clearly noticeable. For the state governments, the pre-reform, the expenditure was about 70.2 on social sector spendings. It went down to 63.2. Overall, there was about 6 to 8% drop in the social sector spending. How about the pattern of public sector plan outlay? This has also gone up and down, and particularly between outlays and actual, there has been some improvement, but not necessarily a continuous improvement as you would expect. With country getting richer and more endowed, you would have expected more to go into this kind of spending, which hasn't. So what if what we talk about the social sector expenditure by states and center, you would see that when the states have over time, and this is up to 15-16, if you update the data to 17-18 or 19-20, you would see that there's not a significant change in the pattern that I've already shown in this particular table. You see that the states tend to spend little more compared to the center, which was spending about 1.13% of the GDP in 1991, went up to about 1.89 in 2010-11, and then went down back again to 1.67 by 2015-16, right? So it's like a roller coaster thing, going up and going down. Overall, as the GDP is expanding, we are trying to talk about large trillion dollar economies. What's happening to the percentage being spent on the social sector is still going down. So on the whole, you would see that the capital formation and the expenditures on social sector at the state level and the central level, which Professor Marji talked about slightly, where do we get the money to spend on social sector activities and other things at the state level, are really suffering from this particular trends. If you look at the NREG expenses, which the current situation is probably a way out for people who have come back from their from the locations where they worked as migrant workers and back to their local regions. I mean, government is probably depending a large on NREG expenses to cater for this kind of people. But this has also changed in terms of all the expenses incurred at the state level varies, right? So it's not like that you go to any state and you find 100 days job or even more than 100 days job easily, given the allocations already made by the government, easily implemented, not done. Not so easy to be implemented as of now, because the amounts already allotted to these sectors might not really accommodate the additional demand for such jobs when the migrants do come back from their locations to their origins. So, given this motivation, if you would allow me briefly, let me just go ahead and walk you through a short model, which is about a model of regional production and mobility of workers. Professor Ray, do I have like 5 or 6 minutes? If I do, I'll just go ahead quickly. No, so consider.
You can continue. You can continue.
Okay, thank you so much. So consider a developing country with J regions indexed in a continuum. Each region of the country has the potential to produce two goods: a traditional industrial product, and which is X indexed by J, and a function of unskilled labor only, with usual convergence conditions that that the second orders are negative, so you get a smooth concave production function. And the output Yj, which is that of a modern sector, uses skill as the main ingredient, along with infrastructure I. So unlike the region-specific endowment of unskilled labor, the supply of skilled labor is, however, dependent on how much infrastructure in that particular region J is made available for production and use of skilled labor. This is given by SSJ, as in, I'm going to show you the equations in 1 second. So let us define WHJ as the skilled wage in determined region J. This is very region specific. WJ is the unskilled wage determined in region J, and KJ is the price per unit of infrastructure in region J. Okay, I call it autarkic because it's almost like saying that if suddenly, due to a COVID outbreak, borders are sealed down, then states become almost like in an autarkic state. You don't trade with anybody, you just produce and consume within the region, within the state, and that too in a restricted fashion. So it's more like you are cut off from the rest of the world, you are on your own, and then the regional economies have their own dimensions to be explored. That's the formal structure. So you see equation 12.1, like I said, it was from a chapter which I just, copied and pasted here. It's my own work in a book volume. So it's perfectly legal, I would say. So XJ is the production of the traditional good, which could be agricultural, and production of agriculture and allied stuff. YJ is the advanced good, which requires both skill and infrastructure. SJ, which is the skill production, is a function of how much infrastructure endowment that region J has. LSJ is, of course, dependent on the endowment of unskilled labor in that region, and infrastructure is also an outcome of the infrastructure endowment in that particular region. Equation 12.6 tells you the utility function of a representative consumer, who consumes both X and Y. I will not use too much of that. I'll just go on to the production side first. So let's come to equation 12.7, which is basically suggestion that if the profit in sector XJ, if you can see my cursor, it's right here above the blue arrow, pi XJ is a function of the amount of labor used in that sector, the wage paid in that sector, the amount of unskilled labor used, and the price paid, right? So it's very clear. You can tell how much the labor demand is, which is basically equation 12.7, which is a negative function of if the wages grow, the demand is definitely going to fall, the standard labor demand curve coming out of it, okay? And in case of full employment, if that region is fully employing all of its unskilled workers, then the wages is determined from the equality of the endowment and the labor demand, which is basically equation 12.8. Now, 12.8 shows that as the endowment of unskilled labor rises in the J8 region, the equilibrium wage falls. You can directly see from 12.8. If you have questions in this about this model, my email is available. You can easily Google me and you can send me any questions you have in this case regarding this structure. On the other hand, if the price of this commodity PX goes up, you can see that there's a positive impact on the unskilled wage in equilibrium. What happens due to COVID? So COVID-19 and lockdown can give rise to two subsequent situations. One, PX being the price of the commodity produced by the unskilled labor, and the price may temporarily rise as the regional lockdown happens. Now, if we do hit the market, we saw that right before the lockdown, prices actually went up. Let me give you an example. It's more like saying that before the lockdown kicks in, it's like your potato, your tomatoes and onions are lying in the field, right? And a lockdown is going to happen. Your trade is going to stop, and you need to pull that up out of the field and somehow keep a stock on that. Put it on storage, right? So you would make these workers go work harder, even willing to pay them a higher wage, because you know that the prices of things are going to go up because the supply is going to be snapped at some point in time, which is going to happen very soon. You don't know exactly when, but at some point. So this may raise wage in the short run, although the real wage of unskilled workers might actually fall. So the wage response might not be as high as the price response. That's my conjecture. If we had better data about the labor and the prices in India at this point, one could actually reflect on what exactly happened to the unskilled workers during this particular phase. Number two, once the local supply is exhausted, there is no production. So the field is exhausted, the stock is exhausted, there's nothing to harvest, there's nothing to produce, PX falls to zero, and workers seek to return home. You see, as PX goes down to zero here, as you can typically tell, this is childish almost, but WJ star becomes zero, right? Now you see that workers stayed back for 1 month, 1.5 months. Nobody wanted to come back then. I don't know what are the actual physical restrictions or or frictions about their coming back, but there was much less of a drive to come back home in the initial phases because they thought it would continue for a while. There was no clear instructions from the government about when it's going to get lifted. So they continued for a while because if production starts back, they would keep earning their wages. When the production stopped, they wanted to come back later. So it's like a staggered effect. You stay back and then you want to come back to your origin. The time span involved about this staggering effect actually depends on the Jth region's size and other factors like infrastructure. So skilled workers, this is the last two slides. Skilled workers case is slightly different. So I've explained the unskilled workers case. Let me just briefly tell you about the skilled workers. The case of skilled workers is different in the sense that the total cost of producing Yj is according to the infrastructure price Kj per unit and the skilled wage Wsj. Now, if you maximize the profit in sector Y, which according to the region is produced given the endowment of skill and infrastructure, is equation 12.9. You see that there is some kind of a slackness condition involved here because I don't know how much skill is produced in that region given the infrastructure constraint. So I allow for some mismatch between the endowment and the demand, which is the reason for these slackness conditions, right? So this is standard procedure. Any exposure to standard micro, undergraduate micro will tell you that this is the way we know that unless endowments are constant and fixed, we have to make some allowance of adjustment over space and time. So this goes on, we solve for it. I'm not going into the details of the solution of this, but essentially in the same way as I solve for the unskilled wage, I solve for the endowment of skilled wage as required, the demand for skilled workers as used in sector J and requirement of infrastructure as used in region J in equation 12.10 and 12.11, right? So this is a demand for skill and infrastructure in region J. You solve for it, you choose the slackness conditions, you go for it, solve for it, and go all over it. You find the final Wsj. What's important here is that if equation 12.9, as I showed you already, is an unconstrained maximization, that there is no constraint about infrastructure creation and skill as an outcome of how much infrastructure is available in a particular region J, then Wsj is a solution to skilled wage in that particular region. What does it tell us? It tells us that under the unconstrained case, infrastructure in equilibrium in region J is more than the requirement or the endowment in Jth region I tilde J. This further implies that the unconstrained wage W prime Sj is greater than the constrained wage is greater than the unconstrained wage. But despite such potential wage differences prevailing across regions, mobility of skilled workers will not take place toward the unconstrained region because infrastructure cannot be transferred along with skilled workers. So I'm trying to reflect, somewhat. I am not sure how clear I am because, it probably pays off to be present physically and explain through, some body language perhaps. But in any case, this is probably going to supplement Professor Shorkar's point that infrastructure development, as the government had promised, the going back to public works would probably mitigate the infrastructure gap that exists between two regions, one where the constraint is present, one where it isn't, right? And despite the fact that, think about Northeast, there's a lack of infrastructure facility, yet the skilled wages are extremely high there. Why don't people just live there? Because infrastructure cannot support or employ the amount of skill that can still pay you higher wages, but there's not enough jobs to be had, right? So skilled workers move out to Bangalore, they go to Noida, they go to Pune and find jobs there. They're not going to come back to Northeast, even if the fact exists that Northeast is least affected by COVID. They're not going to come back, but the unskilled labor are definitely going to come back because they have exhausted their resources over there. So this is what I had to say. In light of the COVID-19 related disruptions, therefore, it is probably not expected that skilled workers will return to respective origins, even if production stops everywhere and no trade between states, I would mean by that, takes place. In case of strong family networks and availability of social capital, the results may be different. So this is a way one can possibly explore that people might come back if social cases are much more compelling for these workers, and actually help them to retain the status back home. Okay, so I'll just stop sharing now. I'm going back to the screen, and I hope I've actually taken more time than I'm allotted, but I wanted to make a regional economies do really differ in terms of the infrastructure, skill and unskilled capacities, which makes this pandemic a real problem in terms of migration between regions, and why skilled workers would be stuck, unskilled workers would be mobile. This is not something we can avoid unless the infrastructure are paralleled up across regions. Thank you so much.